I'd like to, the title of this section has to do with basically scientific behavior, and one of the questions is, why do scientists herd? Well, one answer to that is it is in the nature of science. Science is often thought to be a public good, but it's also a contribution good. In science, you have to acquire a large base of knowledge, produce original products to become a member of the club, and then the members of the club share their original products with you. You can think of it in terms of patents, you can think of it in terms of research discoveries, and so you get communities of self-interested, self-reinforcing people. Thomas Kuhn would say that's how paradigms are formed, overarching worldviews for certain subjects. I would say the paradigm operating in climate change is that climate change is horrible, the sensitivity of temperature is very high and dangerous, and that is being assaulted very seriously, and I'll get into that. The idea that science is a public good goes back to Francis Bacon, Francis Bacon in the late 16th century, early 17th century. But Bacon was an interesting guy. He said, "There is not any part of good government more worthy than the further endowment of the world with sound and fruitful knowledge." And thus began the notion that science was a public good, that taxpayers, governments, etc., would fund science because there was a market failure. Science was not funded properly in the private sphere. And this argument has prevailed since Bacon elaborated it. Terence Keeley, the president of the University of Buckingham, and now a fellow with the Cato Institute, Center for the Study of Science, he wrote the book, meaning The Economic Laws of Scientific Research, said the myth that science is a public good may be the longest surviving intellectual error in Western academic thought, having started in 1605 when a corrupt English lawyer and politician, Sir Francis Bacon, published his Advancement of Learning. What Keeley did is he actually studied science funding and noted that prior to World War II, with the exception of the centralist governments of France and Germany, science was almost all funded by private foundations and private corporations. And there is no significant difference in the quality or the quantity of advancing science that occurred when science became a public good, but a public good it did become. The public nature of science was institutionalized in the United States by the beneficent Franklin Roosevelt. This is a wonderful newspaper column you see here. I'm using my computer. That's what I'm doing. Sorry. That's Keeley's quote. Here's the beneficent Franklin Roosevelt. And you can see all his children are the various beneficial acronyms that are used for the betterment of human life. Now, one thing that was important that happened in the Roosevelt administration was we got into a terrible war. And Albert Einstein signed a letter, actually written by Leo Szilard, to the president, I believe it was in 1936, and it said, you know, science has advanced to the point that we may be able to create a weapon of phenomenal destructive power, and that may be very important in the war that appears likely to come with Germany. P.S. The Germans are working on it too. And so that begat the Manhattan Project, which was an explosive success and was the complete socialization of the relevant scientific community, which included physicists, chemists, mathematicians, graduate students, undergraduates. Without computers, you have to do an incredible number of calculations to make sure that all that U-235 gets in the same place at the right time, or the plutonium implodes to the same place at the right time. It's quite the operation. And when the Trinity test went off, Roosevelt knew that we were going to win the war. And so he wrote a letter to the head of the Office of Sponsored Programs, that would be Vannevar Bush, no relation to the ultimate President Bush's. On 17th November 1944, there is, however, no reason why the lessons to be found in this experiment cannot profitably be employed in times of peace. The information techniques and research experience developed by the Office of Scientific Scientific Demonstration or something, should be used in the days of peace ahead for the creation of new enterprises, bringing new jobs, and the betterment of the national standard of living. My God, this rhetoric repeats itself so much under a certain mindset. New frontiers of the mind are before us, and if they are pioneered with the same vision, boldness, and drive with which they have waged this war, we can create a fuller and a more fruitful employment and a fuller and more fruitful life. Science as a public good writ large. So in 2 months, Vannevar Bush the president died, and then a couple of months later, for President Truman, Vannevar Bush had a book called Science, the Endless Frontier. And Science, the Endless Frontier raised the scaffolding to create the modern science state that we have now. It proposed the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health as they are currently constituted, the agency science programs, the clandestine science programs, the defense science programs. And when it came out, wags, if I were alive then, like me, said, oh, this should be called Science, the Endless Budget. But the interesting thing about Science, the Endless Frontier was that the scientists would no longer be employed by the government. The scientists would apply for funding through their universities, and the universities would tack on 50% overhead. This resulted in the universities becoming welfare clients of the federal government. As a result, the culture at the university becomes one of, I sure do like big government, because big government is involved in big science. So the roots of political correctness are not just in personal philosophy, but in the incentives that lie in the system. Now, there's a problem with this. Putting it in the public sphere means that public science is subject to public choice. I scratch your back, you scratch mine. The American Association for the Advancement of Science is not on 12th and New York Avenue in Washington, D.C. because people there love intolerable summers. No, it's there to influence the funding process and to give and get what it needs to give and get. And if you think the AAAS is neutral, I offer you the following image. This was in 2007 when the Bush energy bill was being debated in the Senate. I drove up 12th Street and I saw a banner hanging from the side of this building. I have a very poor image of it, so I will kind of describe what it is. But the bill was the ethanol bill, the bill to enslave the farmers of the upper Midwest into producing ethanol, driving up the price of corn around the world. We can debate the morality of that. I will win. And here is the sign that was on the side of the building. It is a corn cob morphed into a gas pump and surrounded by a pristine blue ocean, and it says fuel for thought. Now, the idea here, the image is that ethanol is very clean and will solve our environmental problems, okay? This is not subtle. This is the science lobbying organization lobbying for a bill to please its clients. And, if this were the Cuban Academy of Sciences, it would say socialismo o muerte. It is what organizations that are in bed with their governments do. And so we created, via everything, a beer for somebody who can identify this image. Yep, it's the State Science Institute from the Atlas Shrugged Part 1. And we started to interact science and policy in a big way. James Hansen, when he testified in front of Congress that global warming, there's a strong cause and effect between human alteration of the atmosphere and current temperatures. When he did that, him and Senator Tim Wirth opened the windows in the hearing room the night before. It was very hot in order to disable the air conditioning. Tim Wirth is still proud that they did that. People were sweating like pigs when Hansen gave his testimony, and 88% of the people polled by CNN 24 hours later said the temperatures in the United States in the summer of 1988 were caused emissions. Scenario B, the observed emissions, and less emissions, and the blue line are the observed temperatures. This is a complete failure. And yesterday I pointed out that, in fact, the entire family of climate models has now failed, and ethical science would remove it. But that graphic I just showed you is the thermonuclear equivalent of the end of the general circulation models as they now stand. But it's going to take a long time because scientists change very slowly. From Kuhn's structure of scientific revolution in science, novelty emerges only with difficulty, manifested by resistance against a background provided by expectation. Initially, only the anticipated and the experienced are, even under circumstances where the anomaly is later to be observed. In other words, we don't see the errors. We don't see this huge problem. Now, I'm out of time, so I'm going to skip. I was going to talk about Karl Popper, but I'm not. There is still time, brother. Anybody recognize this scene? Right. And then it breaks into Waltzing Matilda in the ghost town of Melbourne, one of the most evocative pieces of cinema ever produced. And here's my solution to all this, okay? Very simple. We're going to diversify science. We need to get away from a single-payer system for regulatory science, which is what we really have. How about a cap-and-buy alternative? Let's say the government funds 100 units of research in environmental science that's related to regulatory processes, okay? And let's say, I don't know, the Koch brothers say, you know, we would like to pay 5 units of that research because we have a dog in this hunt. And so the government outlay goes down to 95 units. And then the Natural Resources Defense Council goes, hey, we need to be in on this too. And they put in 10 units, et cetera, et cetera. So what happens? You acknowledge the fact that funding creates biases, but you allow the scientist to choose from a wider field of biases. You give proportional representation on the advisory boards depending upon how much you want to put in. Well, that would work, but it's not very popular. But I think we have to figure a way to get out of the mess that we're in, and that's the end of my talk. And I will take a few questions before I skedaddle. There's one right in front of you.
So just 5 minutes of Q&A for Pat Michaels, so we can just keep this brief and fit in as many people as possible.
So a lot of, I come from a medical background, and a lot of research in medicine is funded by drug companies. And a lot of that research is foo-fooed by people because it's funded by drug companies, but they do a very good job of doing that research. And a lot of the research is completely redundant because the FDA makes people do things over and over and over again. So, you know, we're increasing costs of research for no real benefit.
Well, I appreciate what you're saying, and the fact of the matter is that research has to be replicable. It needs to be transparent. And can I ask you a question? What's your specialty? Okay, you might have an answer for this. How in the hell did Merck not know that that Vioxx would kite blood pressure in a large percentage of the elderly population? And why was it too small? Because people were going to get an answer they know they wanted to get? Yeah, I heard that. Yeah, I mean, it was so obvious as soon as the drug came out that it was very, very dangerous. they weren't small effects in people over 60 who were genetically predisposed toward moderate hypertension. They were 180 over 120 walking down the street. That should have been seen. Next question.
Michaels, that's a great talk. I want to call your attention to a principle. You need to know who your customer is. And you scientists have a customer, a big organization out there already. All you need to do for success is publish a paper in peer review and you think you're done, but you're not. I'm an engineer. I'm a chemical engineer. And our job is to take the science and to convert it into something useful for mankind that's safe and profitable. So if you guys would just align with a profession, we have to have a license to practice, by the way, you don't. And a physician does too, and a lawyer does too. Go to your customer. I'm your customer, and I can do good for you, and I don't need the government.
I agree with you. I will tell you along the lines of peer review, because that is part of the subject of this title, of this session. I had a piece in Nature magazine in May, and people are becoming aware of the problems in peer review. It was published, they hadn't published anything of mine since 1997, the famous demolition of Ben Santer's stuff, and because editors were being yelled at. Well, it turns out Nature started an experiment in double-blind peer review, and I signed on to it, and it got accepted in a month. Now, I tried to hide that I had written it, but it goes to show that there are clear biases in the peer review process. One more, and that's it.
The fans of global warming seem to cling to that narrative with an almost religious fervor. Does the man-caused global warming narrative fill some pre-existing need to express the fact that the Industrial Revolution is wicked and evil and needs to be renounced?
I don't know the answer to that. I would speak to a philosopher rather than a climatologist about that, okay? I need to go because Miss Rachel will be upset.